in announcements. Other than that, let's just have a great round. The motion has been posted, so we can get started.
So I'm just trying to fix up my video. Cool, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Three, two, one. Panel, the problems that affect people around the world, the problems that affect the most vulnerable and the most disenfranchised people around the world are not personal problems. They're not personal tribulation that they have responsibility to overcome. They are systemic societal problems, okay? And that's what we're going to focus on. We believe religion and its great capacity to unite a group and mobilize action should be used to be focused on external issues rather than turning people inward. Now, for setup, so what we would propose is we believe that, like, obviously religion should advocate based on collective action. The narrative they should push through the scripture, which there's plenty of examples of, is that, like, it is humanity responsibility, God-given responsibility to alleviate collective suffering, right? To turn your focus outward to the issues that affect everyone rather than seeing the issue as a personal tribulation. So what that looks like is, for example, the many churches in India that many members of the lower class attend, and that church, instead of succumbing to, like, the upper classes for which the priests are from, actually saying, look, you know what I mean? Like the suffering you face now is not your fault. The suffering you face is a test to overcome, a test that you must overcome through collective action, right? So what's the impact of that? So really, the impact of that is, like, better for equality for 4 different reasons. Firstly, in terms of victim blaming, right? So when you perpetuate, and let's just from the outset, right? Like, this is a pretty common narrative throughout all self-development. Like, this is not an unfair thing that I'm pushing onto them. Like, for most of philosophy, it is taught focus on what you can control instead of what you can't. It's a well-meaning intention, but these are the unintended consequences of that perspective. And just note, in terms of people not being motivated to, like, pursue their own problem, I think people are always going to be motivated to solve their own problems, right? Like, if you personally struggle, you're still going to be motivated to do so. But in our world, people are still going to be motivated to do so to a large extent. But now we're also going to have to mitigate all these harms about to step through. Firstly, victim blaming. So on a personal level, if you're told by literally the most important member of your community, which especially in the developing world, especially for most of the world, right? And especially in some of the most poorest regions of the world, the priests are literally the most important and most powerful people in society. If you're told every Sunday, or if you're told every day that your problem are your own personal test, and you fail that test, for example, you're a mother of single children who can't get a job to feed their children, you're more likely to blame yourself. That's extremely harmful, right? Because now, instead, not only do you have to deal with the external problem, you also have to deal with the mental health issues of thinking that you're the failure, you're failing God's test, but every day that you can't do this. Secondly, in terms of interpersonal relation, other people are also going to internalize this sort of belief, right? So for example, you yourself might be a little bit more successful. You're more likely to look at someone else in the congregation who's less successful and go, oh, well, you know what I mean? They probably just didn't work hard enough. You know what I mean? Oh, they probably just weren't resourceful enough. Maybe if they had a better attitude, they might be able to do so. Maybe if they prayed more, they may be able to do so. Secondly, this actually raises consciousness about the external issue. So, like, just note, panel, like, one of the biggest impediments to actually getting, like, widespread change is that often the people who affect, the first step is raising consciousness of those affected. You know what I mean? Often the most powerful institution of community will project the idea that actually, you know what I mean, what is being done to them is normal. The caste system in India is normal. You know what I mean? The inequality around the world is normal. It's just a normal capitalistic meritocratic society. This normalization has to be fought, and it can only be fought if one of the most powerful institutions in the world throws itself behind the idea that no, we as humanity can do better. We as humanity can focus on the root causes of inequality and the root causes of suffering. What does that get? Firstly, more engagement in movement outside. It means, for example, more engagement in movements like the feminist movement, more engagement in movements like class action, etc. Secondly, so they're going to seek out more movement, right? And as a result, you actually kind of start to diminish the power of those priests who aren't sort of like embodying that ideal, right? Because suddenly people are looking outward and looking for the root cause of like poverty, especially in like, poor region, when they see their priest driving like a really expensive car, but preaching in a really like poor neighborhood, they're going to go, hang on, there's probably something there. That's really important because priests often like rip off their congregation. So we're going to isolate the bad priests, which means all of religion gets a better name. Yeah, and then secondly, just enfranchise of the struggling need it the most, right? Like they need the community, they need the support network of religion the most. In our world, they're more likely to attend church more often, they're more likely to be included more often, because now, firstly, people see them as someone to be helped, and secondly, they're not all constantly being told that all their problems are their fault, which means now they can access that social network. So, and actually I'll take a POI from closing if I have one. I'll take one from my.
Given religious leaders are often white and powerful, why are they likely to be so critical of structures that oppress people?
Even if they're not explicitly critical in that cases, firstly, some will be, right? So that's on our side. But even in the cases where they're not explicitly critical, it's still better on our world that they put out a metaphoric story that more closely resembles the fight for inequality rather than pushes away from it, right? So the comparative is you have these rich white priests that don't care, right? But at least in our world, the rich priests like put out a metric should focus on other people, which means more people are going to take that and go, oh, I'm going to explore the feminist movement. I'm going to explore these other civil rights movements, right? In our case, you still get more people exploring those movements and exploring with that idea, and ultimately like isolating those priests that they care so much about. So what's the impact? And this is the most important thing, right? Firstly, we deliver for those who attend the church, we deliver the most impact. They can go to a social network that actually helps them. Now they're actually going to be included in a network that actually cares about them. Now the most vulnerable people get support from the community at large, from the church. Secondly, and here's another really big one, right? Now, one of the most powerful movements, the most powerful mechanism for human mobility that the world has ever seen is being thrown behind the cause of the cause of the most disenfranchised, right? This is something that's historically happened, time before, like in the past, and now we're going to have it happen again. It means like in the developing community, the most poor can now have like the most powerful, like their most influential institution used to raise their consciousness and to mobilize them to action against the most powerful people who are oppressing them. So proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the leader of opposition to start the opening up case. Here.
Okay. Can I be heard?
Yep.
Awesome.
Okay.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. The main problem with the opposition's case, the government's case, is that the test of God is like just simply not what they characterized it as. Like the point of the test of God, saying that it's like for growth, does not mean that it is your own fault. Instead, what we actually think happens is when you remove the test of God, that is when religious leaders start blaming problems on people rather than saying it's like an ability for growth, that which we think is an actual really positive thing, which we think means if that we can prove that like your side actually exacerbates the victim blaming, we can like prove like we get all of the benefits that they wanted to like claim, we get all of the harms of like victim blaming, and so that's why we thought it was infinitely better to promote the test of God. So 2 main issues that I'm going to bring you in this speech. Firstly, why we think the test of God actually enables people to be more spiritually fulfilled and hence happier. And secondly, how we think the test of God facilitates flexibility and inclusivity of religion. And my rebuttal will be integrated. All right, so how does it actually enable people to be spiritually fulfilled and hence happier? Firstly, let's recharacterize, like properly characterize what the test of God actually looks like. We think it looks like saying your suffering actually has meaning. There's a purpose to your suffering. It doesn't mean that you're alone. It means that you have a community who is also going through the test of God. Secondly, we think like, the test of God is generally applied to like all issues. We don't think it was true that like it was only some groups that got targeted with the test of God narrative. We thought like, every single thing that somebody goes through, like whether it's like small bad or like big bad, is actually like something that can be classified as a test of God, which we thought was a great thing because it generated a sense of community. But thirdly, and most importantly, we think that it sent the message that whatever suffering you were going through was not your fault. It was simply an opportunity to grow. It meant reframing a negative experience into a really positive experience in which you could promote like personal change and you could promote personal fulfillment. So so let's actually look at what the comparative looks like if we don't have this test of God narrative, something that we don't think the opening government really did. So firstly, we think it could manifest in two main ways. Firstly, we think there would be no actual answer for why you're going through what you're going through. Like, in other words, just suffering for the sake of suffering. Why is this really bad? Couple of reasons. Firstly, we think this makes your suffering really pointless. And as a result of it feeling really pointless, you're not sure when it's going to end. You feel really unsupported through the whole thing. You don't feel fulfilled through the whole thing because there's like no sense of meaning to what you're going through. You can't understand. And we think like it's obviously better if there's something that you can if you can explain your suffering. And so there's, oh, POI. Yes, I'll take your POI. Danigan.
So why is like systemic inequality an opportunity for those affected to grow?
Sorry, why is there systemic?
Why is systemic inequality like foisted on the most poor, their opportunity to grow?
Systemic, like you're saying that's like a test of God, which I generally don't think that's what actually the test of God. Like we don't actually see external issues being blamed on like internal, like on individuals in religion. I don't think that's actually what happens. That's in the minority of cases. Yeah. All right. Okay, so why is it also like especially bad to have no meaning to religion? Because we think religious people in general are looking to their religion because they want something higher than themselves. They want an answer. And so we think that like what it means is when you abandon this whole test of God narrative, when you have suffering just for the sake of suffering, it's kind of inconsistent with the whole idea of religion because you don't have like higher meaning anymore. You don't have a high purpose. You don't have comfort. But secondly, and more dangerously, we think the second narrative the church might promote is that it's your own fault. Why is this actually going to happen? Firstly, we think the church will have a strong incentive to actually promote a counter narrative because people are always seeking answers. People always want meaning. But secondly, why are they going to expand like this narrative in particular, like this whole victim blaming narrative? Because we think there is like, a way in which, religious texts can be misconstrued to like say that it is your fault, where you can point to like specific things in the Bible and say you didn't follow this and now you're wrong. And that's actually what's going to happen instead because there's like justification for it within their religion. So we think that's more likely the narrative that they're going to turn to. Why is that really bad? Well, firstly, like all the harms that the opening government said, right? We actually get victim blaming. It means that we get like narratives that like your dad got cancer because you're gay. And like, we get things like more shame. We get things like lack of support because now you have, you feel like everyone is against you. You feel like it's all your fault. But thirdly, we think like you might be actually even more uncomfortable with your suffering. It's honestly quite like manipulative to blame suffering on people. And so we thought like all the harms the government wanted to say about victim blaming actually occur under our side because we actually see more victim blaming if we don't have the test of God narrative. So why is the test of God like an infinitely better explanation? Even if like, maybe like, firstly, okay, we think that it's like you have a sense that you're suffering for a purpose, which means that when you're going through suffering, you kind of have a sense of closure. You also have a sense like that it might eventually end and that there is a reason for everything. And so that's really good because you feel like more fulfilled when you're going through it. But secondly, and more importantly, we think we see a sense of community because we see that like suffering is not something that is your fault. It's something that everyone goes through. And therefore you are not isolated. You are actually supported by your church group. Why is this all really good? Firstly, we think you'll be actually happier when you're going through suffering if you feel like there is a meaning, if you feel like there is reason. But secondly, at the end of the suffering, no matter what the outcome is, because you're told there is like spiritual and emotional growth regardless, we think that you would actually feel more fulfilled and satisfied because after you've gone through that really traumatic experience, you feel like you've grown as a person, you feel like there's a reason for it. And we think that is a really awesome idea that we should preserve. And so why like is this really important that we do those two things? Well, firstly, practically, we think if we can prove that everyone is categorically happier under our side, that is the most important benefit we can bring because being happier significantly improves your quality of life. But secondly, we think that everyone being happier and more fulfilled best fulfills the purpose of religion. Why? Because religion is a way for people to get comfort, a way for people to feel supported and fulfilled. And so we believe whatever side best fulfills the purpose of religion will win this debate, and that is what we've just done. All right, second issue, how this facilitates flexibility and inclusivity of religion. We think the test of God is in fact like a really good general concept that uniquely lends itself to progressive interpretation. Four main reasons for this. Firstly, we think it makes things that are ordinarily seen as sinful and that would ordinarily be blamed on if we didn't have the test of God as like normal, or like as normal, and also like more importantly noble. That's why we see like when there are lots of like gay Christians who come out, they actually get respected and praised because they're going through the test of God and they're doing like, you know, a really good job of it. So we think like it actually reframes those supposedly like negative experiences to be an actual positive thing, and one where people get supported. Secondly, we think that the fact that like the religious narrative tends to be that like everyone has a test of God, everyone goes through bad things, we mean that like it means that there's less ability to criticize particular groups. It means that people feel less isolated. In fact, they feel more included because you're all going through the same thing. But thirdly, and more importantly, we think the people who are most isolated, these vulnerable groups that the opening government wanted to talk about, would otherwise lose out if they didn't have the test of God. Why? Because these vulnerable groups who experience lots of tests of God, if they didn't have this whole like, if there wasn't any religious rhetoric around what they were going through and why they were going through what they were going through, they would like fall even further onto the fringes. They would feel even more isolated. They would feel even less understood. Why is this so necessarily harmful? Because we think it is really unfair that without the test of God, without people feeling understood, that religion is now exclusive to those who have like a generally good life where everything generally goes well. Because we think that is what would happen when people who experience tests of God do not feel supported at all. They would probably fall out. And we believe like generally everyone has a right to religion. Everyone has a right to like feel supported, feel understood, feel fulfilled. And so because we think we prove like that actually all the harms that the opening government wanted to point to actually are exacerbated far more when we don't have the test of God, we were very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to proceed with the opening government case. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
Please do POIs in the chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, when Karl Marx says that religion is the opioid of the masses, he says it because deeper engagement with religion leads people to be less able and less willing to engage with systematic issues and with the institutions that oppress them. I'll be getting to more of why that impacting is so important later in my speech. What I'll be doing in my speech, though, is going through point by point and telling you why everything that's come out of at opposition leader is just wrong. Then I'll be ripping our impacts and telling you why the impacts alone will win when opening government this debate. Okay, so let's talk about the test of God. They said firstly that it allows for spiritual engagement because they said that all groups face a test of God or something, and they said that the test of God that people will face is mostly like minor issues, and even if there are major issues, it's not a big deal. First of all, this is just clearly intuitively wrong. If you're an oppressed minority and you're constantly on a day-to-day basis facing suffering, obviously, when you go to your priest and they tell you you're facing tests of God, you're going to extend that test of God narrative to the entire suffering you have. You're facing more tests of God in that stage, and so the suffering that you have from failing to meet these tests of God will be exacerbated. Then they've said that the tests of God are framed in like a positive light. First of all, even if they are, it's still incredibly damaging mentally for you to be not taking advantage of something good that's happening. It's like being able to say you guys have won the lottery, but you squandered it all. That's also equally mentally damaging. But that's not even the case. And what actually happens is the perception of the people, even if it's being given to them as a positive mechanism, people, when they're depressed and when they're suffering, do not have the ability to perceive this in such a positive way. They will view a test of God as a test that is given to them by a higher power, a test that is given to them by someone who, God, which they have a personal relationship with, which someone who is their spiritual father, and failing that test has had incredibly damaging mental impacts. Show it later. Now let's talk about how it gives no purpose, how this test of God gives purpose to suffering. First of all, they say, if there isn't a test of God, what's the purpose of suffering and what's the solution? We say that's very easy. The reason you're suffering is because of institutional oppression. And if there's no other explanation, people will be mobilized to take action and to fight for their rights. That's come out of Danigan, and that's what we articulated to you. We want a more collectively focused church, and we want a more collectively focused lower class. Now let's talk about there are other nonsense about how suffering for a purpose is good, and that if you're suffering because God has, you think God has given you a purpose to suffer, you'll be more happy. First of all, this mechanism of itself is like fucked, because think about it. Imagine if your religious leaders are telling you that your suffering is good and you should be content with it. You, that the person that's receiving the information, will obviously, if you take government's mechanism, will obviously be less incentivized and less able to go out and actually protest, to go out and actually get reform, to actually vote for candidates, to actually fight back against the caste system which oppresses you. So we do not think that people should be content with their suffering. We think people should be angry, upset, and willing to take action. And this is a very negative harm that the opening opposition has conceded. Second of all, let's talk about this like value of community, that everybody is suffering the same. First of all, like again, that's not important. You can build your stuff, you can articulate your suffering with your community. The most important thing when you are as a person is the community that is the same level of socioeconomic development as you. You as a poor person will not associate with a rich conservative family. You'll associate with your workers, you'll associate with your friends, you'll associate with your peers. Those are the people which is the most important. So in our case, even if you don't have this church, you have a much greater ability to have a community suffering when you engage with those people. Now let's talk about how there's no, like this other point that's come out about them having no meaning about religion. First of all, we've said that we don't oppose religion outright. We say that we want a religion where we want a more accountable and less individualized and priest-focused religion, where the goal of the religion is to incentivize collective benefit rather than foisting the blame and getting benefit through individual motivation, because that is what the church is doing. So we do not think that that's another point that stands. And then let's say, and there's also this like nonsense about progressive like attitudes with the church. They've given this example of gay Christians believing that the church, like God is testing them for being gay. Like that in and of itself is just crazy. Imagine telling a gay person, hey mate, you know the test of God that God has set for you? It's the test is being gay. Like you're gonna repulse yourself. You're gonna hate yourself. You're gonna think, why has God set me this test? Something that is inward to my identity. It makes you hate yourself even more, and there's no ability to call positive change. In fact, if this test leads you to feel more repulsed by your own actions, and then again, vulnerable on the last point of vulnerable groups, they feel far more mobilized by the test, by not having to deal with the test, and by having to take collective action. Let's look at the album closing.
When in recent BLM protests, priests told people that the inequalities were the test, and that to actually get out of them, they had to fight, they had to protest. How do you get that on side government where you don't even have the test of God as a means to get them in the first place?
That's because priests will never tell you that inequality is the test. That's because priests are supported by the status quo. When you have people like Kenneth Copeland, who are religious leaders that have worth of $750 billion, they will never tell the oppressed Black people, they'll never tell oppressed Christians that the test they're facing is economic inequality. So we do not believe that mechanism stands. Now let's talk about the impact. We've proven to you, Speaker, repeatedly, both with our mechanisms and with opening opposition mechanisms, that you get far more self-loathing, firstly, because of the test of God. And what the impact of this is that if you believe that you are a failure and you're unable to provide for yourself and your family, you're far more likely, first of all, to disengage with the religion as a whole, and therefore lose any positive benefits of religion. Second of all, you're also more likely to engage in self-harm, with the maximum of being suicide. This is literally self-harm is just so detrimental. And lastly, any bad mental health means you're less motivated to act in your own future and less motivated to make your life a life better. So that's the impact of self-help. Now let's talk about the impact of not being able to engage with systematic, not able to protest institutionalized inequalities. When you are more content with your life and you look inward for salvation instead of fighting the people oppressing you, not only is this principally bad because we're letting exploitative people get away with what they're doing, it's also bad because on our side of the house, when you remove this, you have people that are coming together and it's thinking, why the fuck does my priest have such a big car? Why am I paying such massive tithes? Why am I being oppressed by the people who claim to represent me? Why is my government doing X, Y, or Z? Why am I in the case system? When you ask these questions, gradually you start feeling angry, start feeling upset, and you attempt to take meaningful positive change. And that is why we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader to conclude the OO case and the opening half. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, cool. The people that we were looking to empower in this debate were likely already religious. That means that they were likely to continue to believe in religion in both worlds. One was a world in which that religion was exclusionary, in which it brought benefits to the richest people that you could not access and could not relate to. And the other was a world in which, even when you were suffering, your religion told you that you had a place there, that the thing that you were looking towards to find comfort in, the thing that you looked towards to find meaning in your life, told you that there was a place for you instead of telling you that you were a sinner and telling you that you did not belong there. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to prove why the test of God is uniquely spiritually fulfilling. Secondly, I'm going to prove why people are likely to still be empowered politically, even with the test of God. First of all, why was the test of God uniquely spiritually fulfilling? Note here that given the primary goal of religion, like as it functions in society, is spiritual fulfillment. Given that the reason that people opt into believing in religion is to believe in something higher than themselves and is to give meaning to their experiences, the team in this debate that delivered this to the greatest degree would obviously win. OG wants to tell you that the sole purpose of religion is social improvement and empowerment. I think this is demonstrably false for two reasons. First of all, that is literally not the reason that people think religion is important. That is not the reason that they opt into it. It's not the reason that people choose to believe in religion, and the reason that it has power is because people look to it to find a narrative through which to understand their lived experiences. But second of all, because religious institutions never prioritize the kind of social change that OG wanted to tell you they would anyway. First of all, because they were just likely to be rich and powerful in the first place. But secondly, because that was not how they got support from people. They got support by giving people a way to understand their life. That was the most important function of religion. Now onto actual arguments. The big push that we get from OG is that victims are likely to blame themselves. We tell you from Brianna that this is more likely to occur when churches shifted to more specific explanations of religious doctrine. Note here that OG never meaningfully engaged with the comparative of what the likely doctrine that churches and religious institutions would push would look like. We tell you that it's likely to be more specific in a way that is incredibly exclusionary. It is likely to say to people that their suffering was the result of sin. It was likely to be things that were incredibly harmful. OG never gives you a meaningful reasons to believe why, in the absence of the test of God, it would be a different narrative. But why was the narrative of the test of God so fulfilling? Three things to say here. First of all, because this in this debate is crucial. Believing that your suffering was meaningless was incredibly depressing. That meant that you would have a life of spiritual vacuity, particularly given that we are talking about people who have already opted into religion. That suggests that they are obviously not comfortable with believing that life was meaningless. That meant that if religion told you that your suffering did not have meaning, that there was not a reason why you were in emotional and spiritual pain, you would likely be incredibly unhappy. The thing that you looked to give meaning in your life no longer served that purpose for you. That is an enormous harm in this debate. But second of all, because suffering is uniquely hard to understand, we cannot understand the things that happen to us fully. We necessarily impose narratives upon them to figure out how we exist in the world. That's why religion is so important to people. That's why people believe in it in the first place. The test of God was the best way to explain something that was incredibly difficult to understand otherwise. Thirdly, but the third thing to say is that having a reason to believe in something greater than yourself, having a reason to believe that your oppression and your disadvantage was not the only thing that defined you and was instead something that you could use to be empowered, that was incredibly empowering in a personal sense, but also, as I'll go on to talk about later, that is particularly empowering in a political sense. Why was this particularly good for the people who were the most disadvantaged? Those were the people that OG said they would help. Why do we get why specifically do we make the lives of religious people who are disadvantaged more meaningful? Two things to say here. First of all, because the narrative of the test of God was uniquely applicable to these people's experiences, particularly given a lot of things in religion were not. Some people did not live close to a massive church that they could attend every weekend. Some people could not participate in expensive things like sending their child to a religious school. Some narratives about in religion about how you get wealth as a reward were not applicable to people. But given that everyone experiences hardship, this was something that was uniquely applicable to the people who were the most disadvantaged. That's incredibly important in this debate. Second of all, because the narrative of the test of God tells you that you can overcome things. It tells you that your suffering does not define you, that it is not a punishment, and that there are reasons that you can overcome this. If you are suffering the most, this particular narrative makes religion the most empowering for you. That is a huge benefit in this debate. This is why this is more spiritually fulfilling. That is the primary purpose of religion. That's why we win this debate. Second of all, though, why are people still likely to be politically empowered? Because OG has this big push that people are likely to, the religious institutions are likely to just become super critical and of colonialism and systems of oppression. 4 reasons why this is not true. First of all, as I tell you in a POI and in Brianna's speech and earlier, religious leaders were likely to be male and white and powerful. They benefited directly from the institutions that OG said they would criticize. That meant they would never criticize them. They would never be critical of this kind of oppression. They would never mobilize people in the way that OG wanted to tell you. Second of all, on the comparative, as we tell you numerous times in this debate, they were likely to switch to a kind of doctrine that was uniquely critical of people's note that I was not offered a POI. Of people's experience, they were likely to be uniquely critical of people's experiences who were suffering the most. Thirdly, we think that religion ought uniquely provide people with a source of comfort. We think that it is a massive harm in this debate if religion exists solely as a political institution. When you make it solely like a political activist, we thought that was a massive harm, given that people looked to it for meaning that was more spiritual and emotional. But fourthly, we think that it is possible for individuals to be empowered politically at the same time as believing in religion. People hold this cognitive dissonance all the time. People perform surgery during the day and go to church in the evening. It was possible for people to understand the forces that functioned in society. It was possible for them to be politically empowered and at the same time, on a different spiritual level and in a different emotional space, believe in the test of God and believe that they were suffering for a reason. But we also, in the last 30 seconds of this speech, we also give you material about why this narrative lent itself uniquely to progressive political interpretations for 3 reasons. Firstly, because it was applicable to everyone in a way that other things weren't, given that we tell you numerous times in this debate, the comparative is likely to be more specific. Secondly, it uniquely helped people who were suffering the most. And thirdly, it actually empowered people to take political action. This is why we win this debate.
Just checking I am audible.
We thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the, just say something. There was a slight echo.
Yeah, that was just the other laptop, but I think it's fixed now.
Okay, that's fine.
Can you check? So is it allowed to put POIs in the chat? Is that what we do?
The speakers should indicate prior to their speeches how they would like POIs.
I would like POIs from the room because both teams offering me are in the room, but I don't know about closing off. Is that correct? Yeah. But then say which team you are when you do it. What was confusing about this opening half is was it both incredibly marginal in the differences that we were going to get, but also wanted to achieve huge societal impacts from both teams that was somehow going to be magically achieved when a few church leaders changed their tune. It was unclear from us at Closing Government why either of those was going to happen. What we offer you at CG is a realistic alternative, what you're actually going to see instead of the test of God, and why that's actually going to lead to better religious groups, better religious charity, and a better personal connection with people within churches. I'm going to bring 3 3 points of extension. Firstly, how the test of God itself undermines the personal connections that people make with their gods in a way that wasn't dealt with by OG. Secondly, I'm going to do what OO wanted OG to do and offer a comparative of what we're actually going to see instead. And finally, I'm going to mechanize that comparative and talk about how we actually affect religious charity, which is something that religious groups have control over, whereas the Marxist revolution is something that they probably don't influence that much. Before I do all of that, let's give some responses to opening opposition. 3 things to note here. Firstly, that they just mischaracterize what the test of God was, right? Like a lot of their responses to OG was just to say, well, actually, no, test of God doesn't count for systematic oppression. But that wasn't true, right? The info slide literally said economic difficulty. It was probably a reality that they had to grapple with. But more important than that, we think, is the fact that people turn it into, like, it's not that that stops them from uprising against the system, because that's probably not going to happen on either side of the house. It's probably just that they internalize that pain. I'll explain why later. That's something that's particularly harmful. Secondly, is that homophobes are probably going to find a way to be homophobic and justify it religiously on either side of the house. It was unclear why on either side you were going to get a huge marginal change to the effect of religious bigots on minority groups. Thirdly, they assert that a lack of a test of God means that suffering has no meaning and that the alternative is that people will just be blamed for their own suffering. We think this is false and assertive. What we are going to prove is 2 things. Firstly, that suffering has an incredibly personal meaning that is different for each person and that churches can help facilitate that. But secondly, that the role of God in this society and these religious churches is to help individuals, to be a place where you can get hope, a place that you can confide in and actually get some results there. Okay. First point of extension, how the test of God undermines personal connections to God. And firstly, a bit of framing for this point. We think the wider social change that was offered by both opening teams is going to be pretty marginal on either side of the house. 3 reasons for that. Firstly, broadly around societies around the world, people are getting less religious. They're relying less on religion to fill their personal or other needs. Secondly, we think even to the extent that's not true, we think spirituality is pretty compartmentalized. In the same way that opening opposition said you can go be a surgeon in the daytime and then go to church at night, that probably means you're unlikely to actually, even if your religious leader changes the way they think, it's not necessarily going to change the way you think about society. Only change that matters is the way that the religion and the church changes its impact in society, which is what we will bring you. Thirdly, there are other mechanisms for social change or preventing social change that are much more important. Things like capitalist systems of oppression, those weren't ever going to change on either side of the house. What we think matters more then is personal connection. Why is that harmed? 2 key reasons. Firstly, people, and this is breaking it down to stakeholders, right? So we think there'll be a bunch of people who can't get over their suffering, right? And these were raised by OG, but not really fleshed out. These people probably feel like religion has failed them. And that's worse than just feeling like their problems aren't ever going away. That means feeling that the one thing that you've been told since you were a child that you could confide in your entire life is something that isn't actually looking out for you. It's looking out for other people in society. That's what makes you depressed. That's what isolates you from a community. That's what means that you're never actually going to feel safe. Secondly, if we look at the people who can, in a minute, actually fix things, we think those people just in general get a whole lot less empathetic. I'll mechanize why that's particularly bad in social aspects later, but I think it's particularly important to note here that it just means on a micro level, it's terrible for religious individuals and communities because they no longer have the same sense of community that they might have if they were all going through their individual problems and seeing God as a test of hope instead. Yes, I will take opening.
The test of God told you that no matter your situation, what you were going through was valuable and noble. The comparative is a world in which religion is exclusionary. How do you respond?
Okay, I'm going to respond with my second point of extension, which is the better comparative doing the work opening government should have done. OO asserts that, and what they just told you in that POI, and they assert that this leads to victim blaming. What we present to you instead is a conception of religion as something where God created the world, and then now the world has evolved past the point where God can necessarily control everything. And this is a conception that is theologically sound. Many scholars believe in this conception, but that's how it explains suffering, right? The role of God in this world is not to control everything, being all powerful, but instead being someone you can go to for help and in the name of God get some relief from the suffering that you otherwise wouldn't have any way to get over. God is a personal thing that you can get personal relief from. And importantly, this is an easy narrative for church leaders to justify to people because it means it's something that everyone can get on board with because they can all see God in their own way. And that's something that the test of God doesn't do because some people might believe that it's great that their suffering isn't in their control. and other people might be turned off on their narrative. But we think this comparative is better on a personal level for three main reasons. Firstly, because you can always believe, you never get that situation where you felt like you were let down by your religion, because your religion is still serving its purpose to be somewhere you can hope in. Secondly, because your connection is just simply more unique and personal, which means that you feel like your church is serving your interests. But more importantly, probably is the third reason, is that you're probably more likely to bring in new followers into the church. You're probably more likely to recommend that religion to other people in your community because it's something that you've helped gain salvation from. That is crucial because all the other benefits of this debate rest on how many people actually believe in this religion. Insofar as we can prove you're more likely to get those community bonds, we think we win this debate. Finally, let's talk about charity, because OG tells us that the test of God prevents the questioning of structural barriers. We tell you more in a more nuanced manner that the test of God prevents religious institutions from operating in the best way to avoid suffering. That is for two main reasons. Firstly, because even the act of eliminating suffering would undermine the purpose of the church and that self-discovery and getting over like in your own journey. So maybe on their side of the house, you do soup kitchens, but you never do public housing as a church, right? Because the focus in the status quo is on helping people withstand suffering rather than actually as a church fulfilling your duty to actually help them overcome it. The second reason is that if people are happy with their own suffering, as I proved before, they're probably less likely to be empathetic to other people. There's a less like community drive from the grassroots member of the church to help people. Why is it better on our side of the house? Firstly, because churches need another way to justify their existence. And the way they're going to do that is by actually doing good deeds in the community. Secondly, our time, because grassroots church members are much more motivated to help. But thirdly, because without the test of God narrative, religious groups will instead refer to just the teachings of books like the Bible and the Quran, which actually tell them you have to be nice to other people, you actually have to alleviate suffering. That's more important than what OG brings you, because it's realistic to what religious institutions can actually achieve. It's local social support. That's why we are so proud to be on Closing Government.
We thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the member of opposition to start the closing opposition, please. Here.
You hear me right? Easy. All right, I will start. Up to this point, on the closing opposition, we think that this particular debate has unveiled an extremely narrow view of religion. We think it has explained an extremely narrow view of biblical texts, of religious ideals. We think it has explored almost entirely a Western Christian-centric ideal and view of religion that will be entirely undermined by the removal of essential ideals and principles that are inherent to many different faiths. We think this understanding offered by Closing Government that religion is a personal thing might be true in modern-day Australia, but for the vast majority of the world, unlike opening opposition is offered, religious leaders are not white men. Often they are community members. Often they are imams or sheikhs or people in their Buddhist communities. We do not think that this understanding that religion is only an individual personal understanding with God is actually the important characteristic. Therefore, on closing opposition, we want to offer what we think is the important characteristic of this debate, which is an undermining of the essential religious beliefs that many people hold their entire lives to. We want to reframe this debate as the difference between heaven and hell for the vast majority of people across the world. For many, the exploration of their religious ideals is not a willing self-improvement where they get to understand God in their own way. It is an understanding of what the rest of eternity looks like to them. We want to reframe that as the most important argument in this debate, and we don't really think anyone's got much of a go on hell this time. Okay, moving on. What do we think that has been done so far? Right. So firstly, we heard a lot from opening government about the role of suffering and this idea that the fact that people aren't able to really kind of move on because of the test of God means that there's no structural change. We'll remind them quickly that Martin Luther King was like a pastor or a reverend. Right? Essentially, he was a big religious leader. Religious leaders like the original Martin Luther was a nun. The fact that societal change has come about in its larger scope from religious bases is entirely counterfactual. We think that really religion has provided many benefits, and the test of God, the understanding that you are meant to hold your faith, is something essential to beliefs. I will move on on from that and saying that many times the idea of a test of God, the idea that you're meant to have your faith tested, is really essential. Yes, I'll take your point.
Do you think Martin Luther King and the like did what they did because of the test of God, or because religious teachings should actually care about it?
I think it was both, right? I think you could understand that the suffering they were undergoing allowed them to refer back to their faith more and more. I think that they also, it is not mutually exclusive that the Bible says, love thy neighbor, and also God will test you. I think that Martin Luther King was able to acknowledge also both sides of that extremely nuanced argument, and he was able to take into account that maybe this suffering is a chance for me to express my faith and the beliefs like love thy neighbor expressed in the Bible. So I think it was entirely the purpose of his faith to do so, and the test of God allowed him to do just that. So moving on to my main substantive and what we think is essentially the biggest extension in this case, which is a reference back to the ideals and the values of faith and many different religions across the world, right? So firstly, where do these teachings come from? All sides in this debate have offered this understanding is quite nebulous. These ideas just kind of come from nowhere. That individuals might want some personal benefit of their priest. These are real religious teachings. They come from many different parts of many different texts. We don't think it's a particularly good argument that they just come from nowhere. That's our first basis and really important to understand. Therefore, what does moving away from these essential teachings mean, right? Inconsistency is inherently bad in millennia-old faiths, right? The church, the Catholic Church has shown that again and again, that when they are inconsistent, they tend to have some general issues with how people kind of approach them. That's a reason that many faiths maintain their traditions. As closing government offered, right? The Quran, the Bible offer many different people, many ideas. They wanted to push us back into these teachings. We entirely agree, except the test of God is an essential teaching in almost all faiths, especially Abrahamic, in which the opposition has tried to narrow down this debate. We think that the role of, that guy getting swallowed up by a whale wasn't just a test of his shit swimming. It was probably a test of the fact that he trusted God to get him out of there. We think that the acknowledgement of jihad in its many different forms and often the non-violent forms in Islam is another test of faith. Right? We think that test of faith is being kind of, and test of God has been kind of misconstrued by this particular argument, and we think it's a really essential principle for many people's biblical, their religious understandings. Why is this extremely bad? Just a second. Why is it extremely bad that this is removed? Well, we have a couple of reasons. Firstly, we think that you drive people away from their faith. Right? We want to keep as many people in their faith, as many people in the support systems that have been offered by opening government, closing government, and opening opposition. We think if you drive people away from their faith by acting as deeply inconsistent, by showing that it is not able to hold up to its original standing, right? We don't think that those people are going to maintain in those support systems. We think that the test of God does actually allow people to understand their suffering. We agree with opening opposition that is a really good means in which to build community, to build an understanding of the civilization, the struggles around you. If you entirely disenfranchise people, you do one of two things. Either you create extremists, which we have seen again and again, that when you go against mild parts of religious text, where you mold to the modern world, or where you mold to this new personal understanding of God, the closing government wants to offer, right? Then you tend to push people to really extreme religious views, which we think is extremely faulty. And secondly, you just entirely take away their purpose and understanding in life, right? For many people beyond Australia, a crisis of faith, a crisis of community is not only a dangerous thing personally, but a genuine dangerous thing. Right? We want people to be maintained in their faith. We do not want them pushed away by inconsistencies within this idea. Right? Why is this, however, the most important idea in this entire debate? Right? We think it remains the most important idea because surely the side that is able to offer the best defense of the essential institutions that make up most of society, surely the side that is able to not only understand religion in a narrow Western view, but to understand it the best for the developing world, for the world as a whole, is the one that wins this debate. And I'll move on to that in my last little section, which is we have heard a little bit on either side about what this means for those in the developing world, especially the opening government. Essentially, we think that it's actually pretty awful for those in the developing world to have their essential religious teachings taken away. It is not a personal belief in God for them. We think that they do not have the other resources that the opening government has kind of imagined will be there if they leave their faiths and if they are unable to really trust their faiths, right? There are not going to be access to community mental health services. We think that communities overseas, communities in developing nations, communities in the United States, especially Black communities who have used their religion as a bind and have used their religion, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, as the opening government just dismissed as though it wasn't a real example, right? Have been able to show that people do use the test of God. People do use the test of God and suffering in order to get past their struggles, right? We think in the developing world,
on that.
Being unable to do so, you're out of time. Being unable to do so is going to be extraordinarily difficult. We think that they're not going to be able to have any other support systems, and therefore the damages are extremely coherent on opening government, closing government case. Therefore, we think in the closing opposition, we have done the most important thing in this debate, which is not corrode the institutions of religion that so many people rely on. We have recreated what is meant to be a broad debate about the beliefs of the people of this world, and not just about white Christians who want a personal exploration of God, right? And therefore, we have shown what is most essential in this debate and extended beyond just what opening opposition has offered to a real, clear example of what religion means for most people. Thank you very much.
Friends, just give me a second, just one.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Excellent. I'm going to assume everyone can hear me and I'm going to start. Okay.
Oh, just a second. Oh, wait up. Yeah.
One second. I think the chair went. I think the chair went to the washroom. So just wait for them to come back.
Excellent. I'm going to lead us through a guided meditation.
Sorry about that. Yeah, okay. We thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the government whip to conclude the Gov case. Here.
What I'm going to do in this speech is I'm going to use my 16 years of religious schooling to absolutely body all other sides in this debate, because I think the most important thing is to understand what tenets of religion are fundamental, the level of debate that occurs in religion. And then what I'm going to do in this is I'm going to prove to you that religious debate occurs, so there actually is room to change narratives. But secondly, I'm going to tell you that one of the most consistent things in religion is charity and the role of religious institutions in performing charity. We're the only ones who talked about that. At that point, that's when we win this debate. So first, let's deal with closing opposition. Okay, I think the biggest thing that closing opposition tells us is that these teachings come from religious texts and they're like set in stone and they can't be interpreted. First of all, religious texts are incredibly open to change. There's been literally hundreds of years of theological debate about why suffering occurs, because there's hundreds of years of theological debate and different conceptions of the way God works, to the idea that God is omnipotent and God's just like sitting around playing house and doing all the stuff, to the conception that God abandoned us years ago and we're kind of just vibing. There's so many different conceptions, to the extent that we actually can create a large amount of change in the narrative to create one that actually creates positive social outcomes and positive outcomes for people. We also think that that means that like the whole like closing opposition case about, okay, people will be driven away from their faith because they see their entire conception of religion changing. Because this debate occurs, because it occurs in theological spaces, people are probably aware of these discussions. They probably like wander off to youth group and have a bit of a chat about what is God doing? What does it mean, right? And that means that all of the opposition of closing opposition's material about people being driven away from their faith is contingent on them believing that their faith is just totally changing and is fundamentally inconsistent, right? We are able to win on their metric because discussions around faith and discussions around what God looks like have been occurring for hundreds of thousands of years. Well, not hundreds, they've been occurring for like 1,000 years, right? And people are, and like religions still exist. So we thought that meant that a lot of their material that was like fundamentally important to their case just totally drove out of, right? I also think that like the other thing they say is that people do good stuff because of the test of God. What I'm going to say to you is that the reason why people do good stuff in religion is actually because charity is a fundamental pillar of religion. And in order to like engage with your religion, you have to engage with charity. Let's make sure that closing opposition doesn't think that we're being Western centric. No, thank you. Because a lot of Buddhism is about like going to the temple and helping out the monks, and the monks do a lot of religious charity. One of the pillars of Islam is almsgiving and giving to charity. In Christianity, you go and like collect stuff at the bin. Lots of churches like run soup kitchens. All like religious charity occurs across almost all religions. No, thank you. Therefore, that means that that is actually what we have the most capacity to change in this debate. Because I think what happens is, and this deals with the opening half, is we actually need to think about what this, given that we can change this conception of religion, what does this new conception of religion look like? Will and I tell you two main things. First, that there is a conception of religion, which is kind of like a Greek myth, Mount Olympus style, where gods like create the world or whatever, and then the world eventually falls out of their hands in terms of omnipresence, and it evolves to a point where it is incredibly complex. And the complexity is what creates the suffering. Then the role of God becomes someone that you ask for help, someone that you find faith and leadership in, because now it's not about God giving you suffering so you can just sit through it. It's about being empowered to use God to go and fix that suffering. It's not God testing you, it's the complexity of the world testing you. That's what this narrative looks like. Here's some key ways, no thank you, why this actually is directly response to opening opposition. I think one of the main thing they say is that they just make people happier going through their suffering. That's a large amount of their case. I think that like, if you are happy going through your suffering, then you do not seek to alleviate your suffering because you don't see it as being as bad. What we do on our side of the house is we actually empower people to go, okay, suffering is not something to be withstood, it is something to be fixed. Also, this actually empowers religious charity to a massive extent, right? Because currently we see a lot of religious charity is focused on helping people withstand suffering rather than fix suffering. This is why they offer soup kitchens instead of like public housing at the church. This is why we have vinnies rather than like giving clothing directly to these people, because we're helping people withstand suffering rather than trying to eliminate the barriers to the problems. And one of the key reasons for this is the fact that really, like, if you fix these problems, then you are saying that you are able to fix the test of God, which is literally an affront to God. Once you remove that and it's about, okay, we're empowered to fix these problems and make these changes, then you empower religious charity to a great extent. So given that all religions participate in this charity to some extent, we think what this looks like is you empower this charity to be a lot better and a lot more powerful. Maybe churches open up their spare rooms because they don't have as many like priests or monks or whatever to the homeless. Maybe we get even better soup kitchens. Maybe we empower the churches churches or other religious institutions to actually do things that are within their power. I think what happens in this debate is, I think one of the main considerations is, I think that like people's personal conception of religion is quite awash in this debate for a few reasons. I think firstly, if people are deeply religious, they probably find comfort in any narrative on both sides of religion, right? If people are deeply religious, and these are the types of people that we've all agreed they're talking about in the debate, they will probably adapt to these narratives. Then what actually becomes marginal is what are religions actually capable of doing, and what are religious institutions actually capable of doing. The problem with the opening half of this debate is they were like, the church and Marxist revolution, that seems pretty capable. We'll explain to you, that's probably not going to happen, because like religious institutions are not all of society everywhere. They have declining power in a lot of areas of the world. But even if they do like have a large amount of power, there's lots of people who have a different conception of themselves in their religious space and out of it. So maybe you're a doctor during the day and you go to church at night. So you're probably not going to like do Marxist revolution in the day, but what you might do is you might help the church set up a public housing program to help the homeless at night. I'll take you.
It's not an explicit rebuttal of your opening.
No. Because what we've done two things to our opening. We've actually made it more reasonable. We do think churches have capacity for social change, but they're able to do it in a way that is specifically nuanced, right? Like what a church is actually able to do. We've created a more reasonable conception of the case. We've also provided you like, what does a conception of God and religion actually look like in this debate? We've provided you that. So we basically laid the groundwork. We've agreed that this narrative can change, and that is empowering for social changes, not to the extent that opening Gov wanted to tell. So what we've done in this debate is we've explained to you why this narrative is capable of changing and how it can change positively. We've explained to you that the marginal case in this debate is what are religious institutions able to do to change the world. We've explained to you why that's religious charity and why we get that on our side of the house. For this reason, closing government wins the debate.
We thank that speaker for that speech. We now welcome the opposition whip to conclude the CO case and the op case and the debate at large. Yeah.
Before that, how do you want POIs?
Yeah. I presume that's yes. Good.
How do you want POIs?
Just put POIs in the chat. Speaker, when closing government wanted to tell you that they weren't being entirely like Western centric and then literally told us that they could change the narrative of religion so that suffering wasn't important and that God has like suddenly left us, they'd probably forgotten many of the verses of the Quran and like the fact that Buddhism, like suffering is inherent to Buddhism, the fact that in the Quran it literally says Islam has been made perfect. Like we actually think this entire like idea that you can completely change religion and then people have to go along with it because, you know, they're pretty devout, they'll believe it, is just absolutely absurd, and it kind of shows you where they are in the debate today. So we have a couple of points of response about what we've told you. So what we've told you at member is the fact that none of this actually matters in the debate if you lose people actually following the religion, right? So it doesn't matter what you hear from opening government that people are going to change to these like new values and go and cause social upheaval if it means that they actually get less followers in the first place. And then secondly, it doesn't even matter if closing government get like more charity, because if there's no one to actually support the church and give them that money for the charity in the first place, it doesn't matter. What we do uniquely over the opening opposition speaker is we actually mechanize this into something that's not so like marginal about like whether you slightly get more social action, but actually that's something so core to these people that it affects literally every member of that religious group. So we have 3 points that we need to discuss in this debate. First of all, which is more of an opening issue of just like why it doesn't actually change any action if you change and stop having this test of God. Secondly, how this actually affects belief. And then thirdly, more towards the closing government, about how it actually affects the church as an institution. So onto the first issue of like why this doesn't actually change any action by changing the test of God to these other narratives. Well, firstly, we think it's not mutually exclusive that preachers can be pretty progressive and be like, go out, go and protest, do different things. We thought it was really unresponsive that they'd never actually like mentioned how this is very unique to not having the test of God. We also thought it was pretty ironic that no one engaged with something other than religion. Like literally the fact that everyone kept saying churches and priests kind of tells you people forgot, you know, suffering is like inherent to Buddhism, right? It's like all material things cause suffering. We thought that was pretty problematic that no one actually considered the fact that the purpose of that is to show that having these possessions, having these like envy, all these issues causes this, and it's so core to religion. At the point at which you change that, you're not really encouraging people to do anything else, and it's not going to be core to their beliefs. Secondly, we also thought in the similar vein to the opening opposition that you are more likely to give them purposeless suffering, right? Like we think this suffering is inherent to the beliefs, and the reason why they go with it, isn't because of the fact that they've like been indoctrinated. It's actually written in there, like the fasting of Jesus or whatever. Like all of these things are actually because there's a purpose and there's a grounding in the scripture. And the point at which you say you take that away, you've undermined the scripture, you've undermined the core of their beliefs, and it's not just the priest as a mouthpiece or whoever it is as a mouthpiece, it's actually something that they fundamentally believe in. Thirdly, we also thought it was pretty strange that like opening government would give us this characterization of priests as really bad, like we'd realize they were all wrong, like white males, it'd be pretty problematic. We thought this was pretty funny because at least this harm is symmetric, right? Like on their side of the house, surely priests would also then try to undermine the system. So we thought this was a really strange thing to bring up, because if priests are so bad, then trying to get them to change their preaching will probably also try to like have a continuation of their self-serving interest. We thought this was pretty mutual from their side. Fourthly, we thought that the extending the test, like they had this idea that people extend the test of God to the, I'll take you in a moment, extend the test of God to the rest of their life. No, they actually don't, right? And the reason is because it's so fundamental to their beliefs. And we thought this was just like the most important issue in the debate, because if you tell them that it's not fundamental into their beliefs, then as we've told you at member, it doesn't actually matter because they're just not going to go to religion in the first place, right? They're going to think religion is inauthentic and not actually real. Yes.
Isn't your whole extension about that sort of connection with God entirely derivative?
No, because what the opening actually gives you is this idea that people like want to have this suffering so it gives them meaning. What we tell you is an actual mechanism as to why this is so harmful, because you're actually going to get people to leave. And what they never mentioned any of this, they didn't talk about how religious membership actually changes. So we're giving you a real impact of this, an actual harm, because what they've given you is at best like probably mutual like harm on either side. It's pretty symmetric and it's marginal, as closing government has already mentioned. So, continuing on, the final thing that we've mentioned here is that priests, again, will not be held accountable as the opening government wants to say so badly, because they like are the arbiters, right? Like at the point at which they're telling people these messages, they'll twist it either way on either side of the house. So we actually thought it was pretty symmetric in this debate. It didn't particularly matter the margins that opening government and opposition were fighting on. It actually mattered more in the closing half of the debate about how this changes religious belief and religious institutions as a whole. So what we've brought you is the main material of this debate is how this actually affects belief. And we have 3 main reasons why this occurs. Speaker. Firstly, it undermines the scripture, right? Like no one can actually tell you that no matter how much religious debate that goes on, the fact that someone can say, no, actually God left like 700 years ago because you guys were pretty sinful, that is absurd. That like any religious belief could suddenly just go on like a random Tuesday and be like, so we got it wrong, sorry, right? That's just like completely ridiculous. We think this type of religious discourse that goes on is like whether you can eat fish. It's not actually a matter of that, right? And there's a lot of debate. You are right about religion. And the fact that this debate just comes in so arbitrarily and trumps it all probably points to a little bit of inauthenticity that we actually think people aren't stupid enough to realize. Like the fact that their religion is just taking a right turn to be like, so we were sure, but now we're not. Right. Secondly, we think that this sows doubt, right? Like that's pretty obvious. If you constantly have changing opinions, yes, you can have small changes, but the point at which there's like some varied level of inconsistency, that's really harmful. Thirdly, we thought it was particularly harmful with the closing government's like strange like extension of the model, is that the point at which you said God doesn't have any real power, it kind of takes away from their idea that they're going to follow a church in the first place, right? Like if they think that God isn't going to have that much meaning, like they've left us, why would he actually follow any of like the messages of what God is saying to donate to charity? At that point, doesn't it undermine the entirety of their belief system and why they're following it in the first place? And finally, again, on this idea of discussions, the discussions that we've like speaking about from closing government aren't the type that they've characterized in this debate. And what we've told you is this uniquely impacts religious people. Firstly, because they're less likely to actually be certain in their religious beliefs. They're less likely to follow these new teachings of priests. And that is so unique to the test of God that they get this because it's actually consistent. Secondly, they're less likely to turn to religion in the first place. So all this agency that people have to like do stuff with religious people to convince them of one thing or to get them to donate to charity or to change the institution is absolutely moot at the point at which this harm is accepted, Speaker, which we've explained to you at closing opposition today. Finally, what we hear from the opposition at the closing government is this idea that like charity is going to be better under their side because they're going to focus on trying to fix suffering rather than having suffering inherent. Like first of all, we thought this like sort of mischaracterized what the test of God is. It's not to say that like suffering is essential in the sense that like it has to happen, we cannot fix it for you. We think that like that's very like negative of what actually occurs. It's quite proactive, right? The fact that there is support in these religious communities tells you it's not a matter of just like fixing it, like of just going with it. It is actually an attempt to fix it. But then secondly, we also didn't think this was mutually exclusive, that like you can have pretty charitable people in all religions whether they think it, and that it's not the fact that religion like can't fix it because they don't want to. If religion can't fix it because they don't always have the agency to do so, especially when we're considering developing countries, like they absolutely don't have that power. So we again thought it was very Western centric. So overall, Speaker, what you get on side like the closing government is an actual reason why the test of God, like changing that, is so harmful and so uniquely like damaging to religious faith. Thank you.
We thank that speaker for that speech. We've now come to the end of the round. I would say cross house, shake hands, but you all seem to be in the same room, so you can just greet each other from where you are. Congratulations. I think the procedure now is that all teams and observers will leave the room and the judges will remain here to deliberate. And then afterwards, I think you'll receive your results either at the end of the tournament or after this round, I'm not sure, but we'll know afterwards. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please leave the room. Please leave the room. There's briefing room and then there's Rhys. Rhys is left. Whose device is this? The briefing room device? Oh, it's a recording. Somebody should get that. Yeah. Okay. In the meantime, you can be going through your notes and we'll meet in like 2-3 minutes. Let me try get Okokom to come